Are you afraid of perspective? Does drawing backgrounds make you want to throw up? Do you know how to use 1, 2, and 3-point perspective but struggle to actually apply them to your work? Yeah, that was me for many years. Honestly, perspective just made me like scratch my head, so I just avoided it at all costs. But the funny thing about wanting to be a storyboard artist is that you absolutely need to know how perspective works. So I thought it would be fun, as someone who used to be very scared of perspective, to basically make a video talking about some things that helped me get over that perspective hurdle. In this video, I am not going to be covering what the basics of 1, 2, and 3-point perspective are or how it works. There are a ton of videos on this platform that already talk about it, and they've done a much better job than I ever could. And to be honest, the reason I really wanted to make this video was because I think a lot of young artists, we learn the basics of perspective. We do the exercises, the great, foundational exercises, drawing down a hallway, drawing a corner of a room, drawing a city street, and that all makes sense to us. But then as soon as I felt this way, as soon as I was trying to apply it to the real world, even just like look around and be like, what point perspective would I draw this in? Or trying to draw basic backgrounds for my storyboards. When I wasn't just drawing something I'd already learned, explicitly, I struggled to understand how to break down the perspective accurately. So I figured, if I felt this way, many artists have felt this way as well. And I've mentored students and I can see it in their work, that they definitely understand the basics of perspective, but they're still making these, very simple errors in their work. And no shade, I was too for a very, very long time. And so in this video, I just want to break down some stuff that helped me, and hopefully it'll help you. I've come up with 2 exercises that will help you build up your perspective eye and apply proper perspective to your storyboards. So if that interests you, let's get to it. If you want to do more interesting compositions, it's going to require more complex perspective, and that sucks. And I think one of the best ways to understand how shots are working is just to study them. It's that simple. This became one of my favorite warm-ups in the morning before work. I would sit down, go to Film grab a couple film stills, load them into my Storyboard Pro, and then start breaking them down. With, the task basically being trying to figure out, is this shot 1, 2, or 3-point perspective? Where is the horizon line? Where are those points landing in the image? And just by having to spend some time really analyzing an image and figuring out why it's working or how it's working, you are just strengthening your eye so much more. And, when it comes to the time that you want to draw a composition maybe similar to something like that, you'll actually understand how to do so because you have taken the time to look and study and break down similar compositions. And the reason I love this exercise so much is because it's not intimidating. It's, very little drawing. You're just looking at something and trying to figure out. It's like a fun puzzle to solve. And so it feels like a very approachable way to get started with something as scary and intimidating as perspective. So let's break down a couple of shots together, shall we? Okay, so here I've got this shot from Perfect Blue, and this shot is a really great example of 1-point perspective that isn't just looking down a hallway. It's like a more interesting and unique shot that you might, want to pull off. And so the way that I always start is by looking for 2 parallel lines that are vanishing to the same point. This is probably something that your art teacher taught you. So, this line and this line are going parallel to the same point. And so I just draw those out. And by drawing those out, I'm able to, right here, find their vanishing point. And this shot, it doesn't really have any sort of horizon. Usually once you find the vanishing point, you can draw on the horizon, but that's not something we can see because we're looking downstairs. But for all intents and purposes, every line that is going perpendicular to the camera is vanishing to this one point. You can even see it if this window were to be drawn out, we would see that it too this is gonna look awful, but you get the idea, that this too would conform to the perspective of that one point. But, when I used to look at a shot like this, I would get confused because I would be like, what's happening with these lines? What's all of this about? Is this gonna go off to another point? It doesn't look like it. What's happening? And of course the answer is actually very simple. So if we like take if we take the shot and we cut it in half and we were looking at it realistically, like if we were actually doing it, we would see here we have the camera and it's looking down onto the hallway. These lines here that I have in blue, they're all running perpendicular to the camera, so they're being affected by the perspective of what the camera is looking down on. These lines, which I'll do in red, put in a couple of these, it's these ones too. These lines are running parallel to the camera, right? So because they're running parallel, they're not being affected by the perspective of the camera, and they can basically just stay flat in parallel to where the camera is. And that makes it really easy to start, composing shots when you think of things like that. And so that's this shot basically broken down. Pretty simple, right? Like not too complicated, makes sense, pretty easy example. We did it. Okay, so this next shot is from Colossal. And this is a very similar, this is 2-point perspective, and it's very similar to kind of that corner of the room exercise that people do. But the reason I picked this shot is because there's a ton of camera lens warp in this shot, right? Like Colossal in general, if you haven't seen it, really good movie. Anne Hathaway, Jason Sudeikis, really, really good in that movie. But they use a lot of wide lenses in this movie, and I really like it in this shot because it makes Anne Hathaway feel very alone. I mean, she's in this completely abandoned house, there's nothing in it, and she's all by herself pushed against the wall, and the room looks like it's eating her, right? And the lens is doing a lot of that work. So you can see the warping, it gets more warped the further out you go. And that's kind of an interesting thing that you might want to put in a shot. You might want to add warping like this. And so I think it's interesting to study shots. And if you are someone who struggles to know how cameras and lenses work, let me know if you would be interested in me making a video about it, because I love talking about a camera lens. But anyway, let's break down this shot. So we know it's 2-point perspective. A funny way I'm actually going to start is with these 4 panels. So let's trace these 2, which are coming towards us, right? So where the camera is pointed, we would think this is going straight to it. And so if this is our point, I'll draw a little horizon line here. That seems to make a lot of sense to me, as this being our vanishing point, this being a horizon line. You would think, I feel like when you start to draw a room like this, you would normally be like, the horizon line is where the border of the room is. But really, it's usually your horizon line is lined up with your eye line. So in this point, it's not our eyes doing it, but it's the camera, and the camera is probably like a foot off the ground. So this horizon line makes a lot of sense. So let's just draw it out. So I think someone could, because you can see both walls, you're not directly looking at a corner, right? Someone might look at this shot and think it's 1-point perspective, because I can draw out a ton of lines here. And it covers both sides of the wall, right? So I think, and it covers the floor, right? So you might think oh, this is 1-point perspective. But the reason, gosh, that line's bad. The reason that it's not is because, if we look at where the camera is positioned, and I'll turn this off once really quick, we're off to the side here, right? And so we're not really looking perfectly down the aisle. There is some convergence happening here on this wall, and because of that we have a 2-point perspective. So this wall is conforming to a different point. So let's try to figure out where that point is. I'm going to make my horizon line much longer, and this is the nice thing about doing this in Storyboard Pro, is that you can go infinitely off the canvas. You can't do that in if you board in Photoshop. You can't do that, which stinks. It's stinky. I wish you could, because it does make finding perspective a lot easier, and finding vanishing points and putting them in a lot easier. Okay, great. So it looks like they're converging about here. So this is our second vanishing point in our 2-point little perspective exercise. And so the fun thing about this is the ballooning, and this is something you could really easily do. If you just if you were drawing a shot and you established, it's not really affecting the floor so much, but affecting the walls. You could establish what the arc of that camera distortion looked like. You could, that's a little bit too, it's a little bit too drastic. You could, just like this shot is, you know, really more drastic. Just draw all your parallel lines. Instead of going up, you're gonna go kind of in like a spherical shape, and then you're kind of gonna create that camera distortion yourself in like an animated project, like a 2D or in your boards, which is very cool. I think it would be fun thing to try. And so yeah, that's our little 2-point perspective exercise. Let's move on to our next shot. So this last shot we're going to look at is from the film Okja by Bong Joon-ho. Another really good movie if you haven't seen it. Tilda Swinton. Get excited. Anyway, this is a great like little 3-point perspective shot. So I wanted to play around with it. So this building is super helpful for us. Let's use some of its lines to kind of figure out what's going on here. So I grabbed these two and it looks like they converge here. So it looks like maybe the bottom of our 3-point perspective, and this is hard to get straight, but I recommend always doing it by hand. I mean, obviously I'm using like shift to straighten my lines, but I recommend doing it by hand because you do have to learn. It trains your eye a little bit more. Okay, so then let's get this side of the building. There's like a line here. There's a line here, and don't gotta be perfect. That looks better. Okay, great. So then there's our second point. So everything on this side of the building going this way is likely to conform to the lines I have already put down, and it's looking pretty good, is it not? Great. So then our third point is going this way, because you can see this kind of, gosh, it's going to be tall. You can see this kind of angling up, and that's how we know it's 3 points. So it looks like that's our point right here. So we've got our beautiful little, you know, triangle of perspective right here. And you can see it really clearly on this building. You can see here that, you know, the horizon line is way off the screen, which is really fun to play with. And then this whole thing, you know, I don't remember exactly what this is in the context of the movie, if I'm being honest, but it looks, you know, like a roller coaster. And this is kind of conforming to its own perspective and doing its own thing because it's a curved piece. The building makes it much easier to break down. So this would probably be something that you're more so like inventing as part of the shot. It's not 100% going to conform to everything else, but you could probably just take creative liberties if you were going to draw something like that. But if you want to do a building, that we can break down easy. So I really like using Storyboard Pro for this exercise because I can draw off of the canvas indefinitely, and that is really helpful. It was very helpful for me for learning actually where these points are. But I know that Storyboard Pro isn't the most accessible piece of software, so this is something you absolutely can do in Photoshop and you can do in Procreate on your iPad. I would just recommend sizing down the image to the point on your canvas where you can actually see the lines. Or there's this great video by BAM Animation where they have this little trick to make starburst in Photoshop and move those around. You could basically move that around until you find where your perspective is, and that's super helpful. So I will link that video below if you want to work in Photoshop. So here's another really cool thing you can do in Storyboard Pro. If you're really struggling to figure out the perspective on a shot, or you want to fact check yourself, something you can do is you can go to guides. If you don't have it, you just go plus on any of your panels that have this little plus. You know, you can literally add it anywhere. And then you'll go to plus and you'll go to guides. And it'll open up a panel that looks like this. And as soon as that happens, you know, you'll be able to be like, this is a 2-point perspective shot. So you'll go to this little plus mark up here and you'll hit, okay, I need a 2-point perspective grid. And you'll see this has loaded in this very accurate kind little tool. So what I would do now, if I wanted to just fact check my work, I would move the 2 points to where I think the 2 points are. And then I would, using this tool, which will keep everything perfect to my points, I would just, you know, check my work. Is this actually lining up? Does this actually make sense? And yeah, this is looking good. You know, like this looks pretty accurate. Yet again, there's distortion on this back window. It's really bad on this one, obviously. It's almost like pointing the other way. But you can still see, like, in a perfect world where this wasn't distorting, that this would absolutely line up with that perspective point. So, okay, great. This looks like it's right. I can do the same thing here. I can add in a 1-point perspective shot. I can put it right here, and then I can grab a new color, and I can, you know, basically fact check my lines. And they're looking good. Awesome. We can do the same thing here. We can put in a 3-point perspective. We can put one here, put one here. Where's our third one? Oh, it's all the way down here. Let's put it up here. Great. So let's see. Draw some lines I didn't do last time. Looks like everything is lining up there. Let's get red. Let's try this bar. Looking good, looking good, looking good. But yeah, so if you're struggling with a shot, this is a great way. You could like line up. You could basically play around with moving the points around till you kind of find what it is, or you can play around with a couple different things and see if it works. Or yet again, yeah, you can fact check yourself and see, like, did I actually do this right? Does this actually make sense? Does it work? So I really like the guide tool as like a secondhand thing. I don't recommend starting with it unless you're really struggling, because you want to try to train your eye. That's the whole point of this exercise. And you're going to train it a lot faster if you are doing it by hand yourself. And then it is nice to fact check yourself when you're starting, because then you can actually see where you've made mistakes. Okay? So another great thing you can do, since you already have these shots loaded into Storyboard Pro, I also like to study them compositionally. So I've got this different shot from Perfect Blue, and one fun way to break it down is to look at how it's using middle ground, foreground, and background. So they've got, you know, this foreground element, this is a foreground element. It's also framing her, like these two, and this is more of like a mid-ground element, but these two bars are basically, and this one too, they're basically framing her in, which is really beautiful. But that's my foreground. I would argue these are like middle ground because they pop out more, so they don't feel like background. And then all of this stuff here is your background. And that's really interesting. You can see she's on a third, and everything is kind of leading your eye towards, right? There's this really great like circle with like this guy here, right? There's this really great like circle that is just pulling you back to her again and again and again. And everybody else's, you know, faces are looking away from the camera and or are obscured, right? Like in a perfect way where we're not really facing on them, but then her face is the only clear face. And you know, like we're programmed to look for faces, so this is automatically where your eye goes. But it's a very smart like little compositional frame. And so this is a fun thing you can do as well, as kind of like, break down the foreground, middle ground, see if it's applying to the rule of thirds, see what they're doing compositionally and why it's working. And some of your favorite shots, you know, might as well try to soak as much information out from this, you know, study exercise as you can. Once you've broken down enough shots and you feel more comfortable with this exercise and maybe more comfortable with perspective, another thing that I think is fun to do -- helpful is to go back through the shots and add grids. Go back to this shot. If I were, you know, drawing grids for this, and I'll turn this off for now. You know, you could, if I had this floor piece drawn out, you could just draw like, and I don't think grids ever need to be perfect. I do always straighten my lines like this, but I don't think like the spacing on them I've never thought, you know, the spacing on them needs to be perfect. They're there to give you an idea. And this, you know, is a very flat on grid. So it's just, you're just putting down that this is like a floor space. And so now we've got this wall, but basically, yeah, if you can define the space like this line and this line does, you know that it's basically an arcing surface, right? So from this line to, we have to transition, basically, you could think of it like an animation. You have to transition from this line to this line. So every line gets a little bit more to the angle of the last one. And that's basically how you make a grid. And if something's further away, you know, it gets more lines. And I'm going to simplify this wall into, just for the sake of this exercise, I'm going to simplify it into being one big wall instead of having this dip down like it actually does. And so this is kind of a fun way just to practice, how to effectively use grids, because then, I can turn off the shot and I can tell, what's happening here. Basically, I would want to lay in more information there and there, but I can start to get an understanding of the shot if I was drawing it. And so that's kind of another fun thing you can add as like a level to this exercise. If you feel like you struggle with grids or how to make effective grids, actually figuring out how to break these shots down into grids. And it gets really fun with like an outdoor shot. I pulled this shot from Seven Samurai, but you can see like here, like the ground isn't perfect, right? Like there's this hilling here. And so like when you draw a grid for something like this, you could, like with more organic surfaces that aren't perfect, you could basically like start to lay in a grid that instead kind of defines like the space more like this, if you really wanted to kind of like show the hills and valleys, like this curves. And if you want to show that it curves, like you can draw your grids like that if that feels good and right to you. I think in organic locations like that can work really well. So that might be something fun to play around with as well, if you feel so inclined. For this next exercise, we're going to start by roughing out a basic sequence by hand. Then, once we're done, we're going to go back in and basically fact check our work using the guide tool. So the way I recommend starting is by picking a location. Try and pick a location for your scene that you find challenging. Maybe that's an indoor location like a bar, a restaurant, or a kitchen, or maybe it's a more organic outdoor location like a forest or a cave. Try and pick something that you don't draw very often. So if you're always drawing things in bedrooms, don't pick a bedroom. Try and pick a location that gives you a little bit of pause. Then, taking that location that you've picked, rough out a few basic shots that could make up a sequence. Maybe, an establishing shot, a two-shot, and then 2 singles. Whatever works. I'm not asking you to board out a whole scene, just a few different angles of the same location. For this exercise, we aren't going to be spending any time on characters, so kind of just forget about them. They're basically just placeholders. This whole thing is about backgrounds and perspective. When roughing out your scenes, pay extra attention to the background, more than you normally would, and really give your best guess on how you think the shot should look. Once you have all of your shots roughed out, we get to do the fun part. You're going to turn down the opacity of your original drawing, turn on the guide tool, and lay in the points where they should be for your drawing. Then, you get to check your work, see where you were right and see where you were wrong. After you do this a few times, you may notice yourself making a lot of the same mistakes. Being able to identify the common mistakes you're making and how to fix them will help you improve your freehand board perspective drastically. Trust me. To demonstrate how effective this exercise can be, I'm going to use a few examples from my previous work. Up until I made my short film Know You Well, I had avoided having to draw backgrounds for any big project. But for Know You Well, I was doing every part of the visual process, and for the first time that meant I was going to be drawing 100+ backgrounds. And the short film, if you haven't seen it, is a slice of life film. And so the backgrounds needed to be very grounded and realistic, which means no shortcuts. And in my storyboards, which I made before I started working professionally, and to be honest, they're pretty amateur, I paid very little attention to the correct perspective. So once I got into making the backgrounds, I realized where the perspective was off. I would bring in my boards and start to flesh out the design using perspective grids, and there were these big mistakes that I saw myself making over and over, and having to fix those mistakes and seeing how the perspective would actually work for those shots was like the biggest education in perspective for boards I could have ever asked for. I saw so much improvement and had a much more solid understanding of perspective after that project, and honestly, without it, I don't think I would have been able to move into boarding just a few months later. So I don't recommend you making a whole short film to teach yourself perspective, obviously, but this second exercise is a much smaller, more obtainable version of that practice. And I promise you, it can really help build up your eye for perspective really quickly. And, you know, it can be repeated as many times as you'd like with any number of locations. And something that's really nice about it is, of course, you don't have to do anything with the characters if you don't want to. It can really be just an exercise to focus on backgrounds, or alternatively, you know, you could take what you're doing and build it up into a whole new portfolio piece. You know, make the exercise your own. Here's how my drawings turned out. So don't run away from perspective. I know it seems scary, and it is. I was very scared of it for years, but genuinely, the more you practice it, just like everything in life, the more you practice it, the easier it becomes. And hopefully these exercises are like a not super daunting way to get into it. And I hope, you know, that you found something helpful in this video, whether it just be one little tidbit or, you know, one of the exercises themselves. So that's my little crash course in applying perspective to boards. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you can, please like and subscribe. I plan on making more educational videos about storyboarding and filmmaking, so you'll want to stick around.